I felt like this question of, am I allowed to like feel what I feel? And am I allowed to say what I think? And that then people will know, people will know who I am.
This is Daring to Tell, the podcast where writers read their true stories of personal daring. Then we talk about writing and life. I am your host, Michelle Rado.
Nothing's gonna make me brave, and nothing's gonna make me brave. Nothing's gonna make me brave except doing what makes me scared.
A couple of weeks ago, I was in the grocery store. I live in Maine, and my grocery store is Hannaford's. And it's been a warm fall, and so, like me, most people are wearing like layers, fleece, flannel, sweatshirts, and even being Maine before snow, I see plenty of people wearing clogs or slip-ons with no socks, even flip-flops. I am someone who is always wearing socks until it's at least 80 degrees outside. Anyway, pushing my cart, scanning for things I knew I needed, as well as things I might have forgotten that I needed. From the middle of the produce section, out of the corner of my eye, I notice a young woman in a white bonnet, like from the Little House on the Prairie days, or the people who worked in Old Sturbridge Village, which was the next town over from where I grew up in central Massachusetts. And I made a note to not stare, but I do sort of glimpse that she has on a long dress. And continuing up and down the aisles looking for the items on my list, black beans, ground turkey, unsalted pistachios still in the shell, which they seem to have stopped carrying, I see her and then another young woman with an old-fashioned dress and a young man with them with an old-fashioned, simple button-down cotton black shirt. They're all in about their early 20s and wearing such anachronistic clothing. And I wonder, are they Amish? Mennonite? I make a mental note to myself. Interesting. As I'm driving out of the parking lot, I see them all together, two couples, the ones who had been shopping, and seeing them all together from inside my car, I also notice black sneakers and white gym socks. And I think, do the rules stop when it comes to footwear? And I don't mean to be disrespectful, and my sharp inner critic pokes at me not to point out any of this, but still, I can't help but wonder, what is it about a religious or cultural tradition that either requires or maybe inspires people to dress in a way that makes them immediately visibly distinct from, quote, everyone else, whatever you want to consider that to be, to wear some meaningful facet of your insides on your outside? I grew up with insides that I felt to be very different from what I imagined everyone else's insides to be, which is to say, we adhered to a religion that taught us to turn away from medicine and really the physicality of the world. But it was with quite a bit of relief that I knew the vast majority of the time I could hide this inner part of myself. Religious beliefs are endlessly fascinating to me. Why they speak to some and not others, why they have seemingly strange and endlessly specific rules. Sometimes it seems like with my grocery store shoppers, there's a very specific era. Is there a date even when they've decided, that's it, after 1890, we're not moving forward past that time? The rules I grew up with were like that too. Maybe in Mary Baker Eddy's day, not taking all the crazy concoctions they called medicine made sense. But after that time, science discovered things like antibiotics. Why stick with the old rules? So many questions. Why? Today, we are talking with a writer who has pushed to ask why upon why upon why. Tova Mirvis's memoir, The Book of Separation, spoke to me deeply with its themes of insides versus outsides and following the rules and then not following the rules. It's the story about her leaving Jewish orthodoxy and her marriage and letting go of rules she can't help but question and pull at. And while at some point one does have to make a giant leap, most of the time the untethering is small and slow and comes apart in very small slices of doubt and questions. Most of all, she shares the daring it takes to not look away from these questions. Tova Mirvis, I am so excited to have you here today on Daring to Tell. I will just first say welcome.
Thank you so much.
It looks to me as if you have published 3 novels before you published the memoir that we're going to talk about today, The Book of Separation. And your memoir, I will boil down to a synthesis of how it was the leaving of Orthodox Judaism and the leaving of your marriage. So this memoir came out in 2017. And before we dig into that, I'm just wondering if you can introduce yourself to me a little bit and tell me how you came into writing. I know also you grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community in Memphis, and I'm really curious to hear about that and writing, if they were intertwined at all, even in the early days.
Sure. I feel like they're always so intertwined for me, my upbringing and my urge to write. I grew up in a small Orthodox Jewish community in Memphis. I'm a 6th generation Memphian. And so I grew up in this with this sense of belonging, of being very rooted in a particular world and a particular community. And really, when I first think about my urge to write fiction, I think about wanting to write about this community. They're almost inextricable for me in my subject matter of what I was really interested in. I think what motivated me to write, for all my novels, whatever I write, in some ways, I'm always interested in what people do publicly and who they are privately. And that tension, I think, is something that I've always been fascinated by in my own life and in fiction and in memoir too. And so I think for me, growing up in this world where there was such a sense of community and public presentation and who you were supposed to be, and I belonged and yet didn't. And I think that for me was the real fuel as a writer. When I started to write my first book, I was at the Columbia Creative Writing graduate program. And it wasn't even a question of, was I going to write about Memphis? It was just, of course I was going to write about Memphis.
Right. Interesting. Okay. So for people like myself who have not grown up in Orthodoxy, can you just explain that a little bit, if that doesn't even sound like too strange of a question? But
sure.
What was that like for you growing up?
Sure. An Orthodox Jewish community really centers around adherence to tradition, Jewish rituals, and Jewish law as the sort of guiding line of really every action. And there's a strong sense of community, a very strong sense of communal norms. Maybe that goes together. The belonging always creates norms for good and bad. And Orthodox Judaism revolves around observing the laws of the Torah. It's called the 5 books of Moses, and observing these rules which govern what you eat, what you wear. There's a series of laws about the Sabbath, what you can and can't do from sundown Friday to sunset on Saturday. There are holidays with myriad celebrations and rituals. And it's almost like a script for a whole life. It's very richly filled with so many rituals and traditions. And it's not, one slice of your life. It's not one little part of it. It really is the whole of a life.
And so were you writing at all through your childhood, like before you got to Columbia?
I mean, I always said I wanted to be a writer. It's hard, my mother saved, my first book in third grade, like Mrs. Brown's Brown Cow or some crazy like that. But I think really more than loving to write, I was always a reader. I was one of those kids who, loved to read, loved to just be buried inside a book. And, some of those books that I read at that age still feel so, so viscerally part of who I am. And I think that
Yeah.
that urge to sink inside, to live inside books, to sink inside them, I think really is what fueled me as a writer. And I would write. I wrote poetry. I was one of the weird kids who loved writing my, college applications, the essays. It was,
Oh,
this
really?
excitement. Somehow all of a sudden it was this chance to like write something about myself. I really enjoyed, it was a new form and I enjoyed that. But in college, I started to write more seriously. I took a bunch of creative writing classes and I had no idea what I was doing really, but even then, even my first stab at a novel was about Memphis. I, decided I wanted to write about this thing that happened in my family when I was in college, and I felt like the only way that I could somehow make sense of this family rupture that was taking place
Mm.
was to write about it. And that was, I think that for me was maybe one of my biggest discoveries as a writer, which was that the way to understand something was to write, even if it was fiction, that the way I could process something and really try to make sense of something that was so hard to understand was by putting it on the page and beginning to lay it out as a story.
Yeah. I can very much understand and feel that. And in your book even, the writing feels um integral with the living part, which is one thing I like to say about this podcast and when I talk with different writers. It's about writing and life. And how did those become, what was the intertwining of those things? Because you also said about you knew early on you wanted to write about your experience or write about
Mhm.
Memphis or write about, like, you knew you were different as a kid, I guess is kind of what I'm also getting at.
I think in some sense, I mean, I grew up with a tremendous desire to belong. I grew up with such an urge to be a good girl. It was just ingrained in me from the start. I was not a rabble rouser. I was not someone who, was rebellious in any way. Maybe inside my mind, I would chafe at things, but I wanted to fit in. I wanted to belong. That idea of the good girl was so ingrained. If you were good, to be good was to be loved. I just felt like that, to obey the rules, to follow the path that was set out for you, to be the person you were expected to be, to live the life that had been laid out for you. It had such an appeal. It felt like you were doing what you were supposed to do. And to
Mhm.
not do it, I mean, when I was younger, to not do that, to not go down the path that I was supposed to, really felt unimaginable. I think maybe for me, writing was a place to exercise some of that rebelliousness or some of that daring, that feeling that, in my own life, I complied, but on the page, that was something else. I could
Mhm.
create a character, not me, of course, not me, but some character to explore the idea. And even my first novel, The Ladies Auxiliary, centers around a woman who converts to Judaism and moves to this small community in Memphis. And she's someone who, on one hand, wants to belong. She observes and participates in the rituals, but she just can't quite fit in. She's artistic, she speaks her mind, she's seen as other in some ways. And at the time, I never thought that I was writing about myself. I never thought that I was that character, but
Yeah,
we're parts of all of our characters. And I think that was
right.
the initial figuring out something about myself.
Exactly. And I think that that was one thing that I really related to in reading this is that it's this thing that's a part of you that is, I I guess I'll say, is a little too scary to look at in the effort to be the good girl and to do the things you're supposed to do. And when those little threads of questions start popping up, you have to pull at them. And so what happened next with pulling at those threads? I mean, you then decided to write a memoir. So that's maybe a big leap. Is there a space
Mhm.
between you had 3 novels, but then you decided to turn to memoir?
Right. I wrote 3 novels. Two of them were about Orthodox communities, and I think what I was very much part of an Orthodox world at that time. I was trying to walk the line of being free as a writer, but belonging to a very tight knit community with a lot of expectations. I thought I can, somehow do both at the same time. I felt like the freedom could come on the page, and in my life, I could be more compliant with rules that I had been raised with, that were always a part of who I was. And it was a complicated proposition writing, trying to straddle something. I always felt aware when I wrote, was this okay? Was it acceptable? What would people think of me? Was this out there or not? I was constrained in a certain way. I think all writers we carry our own constraints, our own inner voices that hold us back. And so much of writing, I think, is about freeing ourselves from those inner voices. But I had a particular set of inner voices. And my plan was to just do this, to live this way, to be part of a world that didn't always feel like who I was, to live with a quiet sense of doubt, to feel maybe split in two, like there were two versions of myself. And
Hmm.
I felt like I would write about it. Certainly my second novel. Now, when I look back at these books, I feel like, oh God, I'm all over this. I thought, no, 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 this is not me at all. It's all fiction. And now when I look at my second book, The Outside World, it's every character in that book is in some ways doubting or questioning or chafing. Everyone is in some state of agitation about religious belonging. And
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe the part of you that writes knows a lot more sometimes than the part of you inside your own life. And so
Yeah.
I wrote that. I wrote a third novel about a woman who felt cooped up in her marriage. Again, all fiction, all fiction. I, nervously insist to myself. I mean, it's so funny in hindsight. Like The Visible City, my third book, is about a woman who looks out her window and imagines other people's lives and tries to tell herself that it's enough to imagine other people's lives and stay inside your own very constrained world.
Right.
And so again, I knew what I was pulling on about my own life, but I for a long time believed that I would stay inside a marriage that did not feel satisfying or fulfilling, and I thought I would stay inside a religious world that I knew I didn't really believe in. It just felt too hard to undo a whole life.
Yeah. Well, and it was. It was a lot to do that.
Right. So, if you pull out one piece, the whole thing topples. And I think, for me, I had to reach the point when I was willing to allow it to all come apart.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's so brave and so bold there on the page because, as you were saying, your study of what is the inner life, what is the outer life, what do you show of your inner life in your outer life? What do these things mean about our beliefs? And I'm still trying to poke at this idea a little bit about the beliefs. Was there something about the beliefs early on that was a question to you, or was that sort of what you were exploring on the page, or it's all tied in somehow?
Right. So all this, some people have asked me, was there one thing? Was there one, it was never one thing. It was just this accumulation of lots of moments. It felt, I think maybe sometimes enormous change doesn't happen in the big dramatic moment. It happens just over years and years of small feelings, of little feelings of discomfort, of moments when you bite your tongue, when you don't say the thing you're thinking. I think all those moments kind of rise and gather and then they overflow. And for me, it felt like this overflowing, really. I mean, I chafed about women's roles. There's a very strict sense of gender and gender roles in Orthodox communities. And there's evolving and there's an Orthodox feminist movement. So it's never static. But for me growing up, that was certainly a hard issue. I would just try very hard to make myself believe in the idea of ritual. I mean, there was beauty in it. There was beauty in celebrating holidays, but I could enjoy it, but I couldn't. I think the theological parts felt harder to make myself believe they were not symbolic or nice, but true. It was hard to believe that of all the people in the world, this was the world. I held the actual truth in my hands. I alone had the truth. And that idea was unmooring. It was scary to let my mind ask questions. I think ultimately I came to feel like I couldn't live with that, that bifurcated self.
Yeah.
The person who was one way on the outside and someone else on the inside. I mean, it was the subject I was so fascinated by in my fiction, but of course, because, probably because I had such a strong sense of it in my own life, that feeling that, I guess in families, in any group we belong to, we sort of have our public presentation, who we are. We put on our game face. We, reveal only parts of ourselves. We say only bits. But it's exhausting to live that way in all of your relationships. And I came to feel like there were very few spaces where I could just say what I thought or ask the questions that I really was wrestling with. And ultimately, it felt like just a relief. It felt messy and complicated and great upheaval. But even in all of that, I think there was the feeling of the relief of pulling the little block out and all the blocks tumbled down. And then they're just on the ground instead of trying. Yeah. I used to feel like I worked very hard to hold something together.
Right.
And I came to feel that I cannot hold it together anymore. And I think also, what I value most about writing, what I love and books that I love, or, when I feel the most excited about writing, it's that feeling of, you write something and you think, oh, I shouldn't say this. And then the immediate impulse is say it. And that urge for honesty, that urge, I love the writers who just say it, who are not afraid. And that, I think, is something I wanted to think it was okay only to live like that as a writer, but I don't think it's okay. It was not okay for me. I wanted to be able to live like that as a person more as well.
That's interesting. So you went there on your writing first and then in your life and in the memoir. So then when did you decide you were going to do a memoir?
Well, I wrote Visible Cities. That was my third book. It took a decade, which is just so crazy to believe. But I think it took so long because I was afraid of the book. I was afraid. I set up a situation with a woman who's unhappy in her marriage, but she couldn't possibly leave the marriage because that would not be possible in my mind. So I had this like trap I had created for the character. And I don't think that I was ready to finish that book until I was ready to really face my own life. And I feel like in some ways Visible City is not the memoir, but I feel like, oh, it's
right.
Am I splayed all over that book? So
can I just quickly ask, so is that the book that you were referring to in the memoir that you were working on?
Yes.
So in the memoir, you're talking about working on a book and the difficulty with it and all that. So that was that one. Okay.
Yeah, that was the book that I was writing as my marriage was unraveling. I mean, it's amazing how we have such capacity to fool ourselves. I was like, I am feeling trapped and unhappy in a marriage, and I'm writing a book with a character who's trapped and unhappy in her marriage, but it's not me. No, I mean, this is not me at all. I mean, it's amazing that ability to fool, I think, yourself so that, because it was too scary. I was not ready to face it. And then ultimately I was ready, and I couldn't finish Visible City until I was, really ready to wrestle with the idea that, it's not enough just to imagine other people's lives, to stay in your own little quiet square and unhappily so, and imagine, live elsewhere in your mind. I think in the earlier drafts, like years 5, 6, and 7 of that book, I wanted that to be the ending. And it took a great editor who was like, absolutely not. This is not true. To really rip it open to force me to see what I was hiding from. Yeah. And so I think that experience is what made me want to write a memoir. Finishing Visible City made me think about this question of, of hiding. What was I hiding from myself? What was I hiding from on the page? And I think that was what laid the groundwork for writing, the memoir.
Wow. That's really, I mean, getting that information from your editor was probably a little like, ooh.
We joke, she's still my editor. We joke about how she sent an email. My agent sent her a version of Visible City. She wrote back and said, I want to see the bold Tova, the Tova who's not afraid to, make big moves. I feel like I hear a quiet SOS from between the lines of this book. And I was just like, oh my God, she sees me. I mean, I feel like she saw it. She saw the thing inside of it.
Yeah.
And she actually sent me a poem. She sent me the Mary Oliver poem, The Journey, which is at the front
Oh,
of the memoir.
right, right.
Which it was
Love.
just,
Yeah.
one day you knew what you had to do and then you began. And it was just like this feeling of like
Yeah.
converging, this sense that, for all you, I think, can try to tamp down doubt, and you can try to not face issues and hide from unhappiness. I think the more you tamp it down, the more it eventually rises.
Right.
And that was certainly my experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Really good. So we're going to hear some examples of that, and we should get into the reading in a minute. But I had, what was one of my other questions I had? Oh, about the rules and feeling special. So I will also say that's something I grew up in a very small and strict religion too. It was something that was really hard for me, which is why I find the analogy, or analogous, between growing up in a set of rigidly adhered to rules that you needed to be.
Yes.
That on one hand, the rules can make one feel quite special, and yet on the other hand, the rules can be almost this source of, I will say, like shame, embarrassment, some of the things that we have to show for ourselves on the outside that may not necessarily be true on the inside, even though you might not know it yet.
Right. I mean, I think it's fascinating to me how there's so much similarity in religious communities, regardless of the specific nature of that community, that there's such a commonality about growing up, I think, in religious communities with rules. I think one of my favorite experiences with the Book of Separation was how many readers who had left Mormonism who loved the book. In some ways, I feel like I found my people, like the people who left Mormonism, or the people who related so fully to it, because it was that sense that you leave ritual, you leave rules, but you leave your whole way of being. You lose this sense of yourself. And I think what you say about rules is so true. On one hand, there's, I think, a beauty in ritual, a beauty in ceremony, and a feeling that my actions matter, that if I do this thing, I can somehow affect the world, or that there's a being who is interested in what I'm wearing today, or every morsel I put in my mouth. Somehow there's a God out there who cares. There's, I think, a great feeling of belonging or connectivity that comes from it, but it is a double-edged sword, because to make a mistake, to decide to stray from the rule, to do one small action that to many people would be the most, innocuous thing in the world,
Right.
is somehow a source of shame, or a transgression. The idea of transgression was an enormous force in my life, that if I messed up or if I did something wrong, that I was transgressing something that was so important and, was so central. And so I do think there's that same feeling. And I think even with belonging, there's such a wonderful feeling of belonging, but to not belong. I think the flip side of belonging is you belong with an awareness of what it means to be cast out. You know the pain of what might happen if I don't adhere. You know that I will be cast out from this sense of tight-knit belonging. And that, I think, exerts an enormous power. There's a real loneliness in feeling like I am just me, and over there's a world where everyone is connected to one another, and I am no longer a part of that.
Right, right. That's another. I grew up in a very tiny, I can't even say community, because I left Christian Science. So it's interesting you say about Mormonism. But I related to the leaving of something that made you feel special on the inside, but to also leave that community is just so scary. I mean, that is a huge risk and a huge step to have to make. So,
right. Leave takings. I mean, I think any kind of leave taking, whether it's a religious community, a marriage, a family, even inside of ourselves, like leaving some part of who we think we are, I think it's enormously scary. And I think for me, one of the, the themes of the book I was really interested in was fear. I wanted to look at what I was so afraid of. And,
Yes.
I had so many fears, from driving on the highway to,
Right.
I had plenty of fears to work with as material in the book, but that sense of how fear keeps you in the same place and that change is enormously scary. It's scary for you. It's scary for the people around you to watch someone you love change.
Yes.
It can be terrifying, to watch a child change, the fear of losing someone you love, even if they're making the decisions that are the best for them.
Right, right. So we see these in dimensions with you and your parents, and also with you and your children, and with you and your husband, who you must also leave, and in the relationship of you with yourself. And I love the scenes about the driving fears. I mean, it's just, I felt like I was right there with you in the car as you were watching the clock tick down. Yeah, that's your opening scene, is driving to Kripalu on Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah, so on the Jewish
Yes.
New Year, and so it was both driving
Yes.
when driving is forbidden according to the law, to the
Yeah.
Jewish laws, and
Right,
for me,
right.
just even driving on the highway. I grew up in Memphis where I drove, and then lived in New York City for so many years where I didn't drive.
Right.
And when we moved to Boston, I was like, no, I'm never getting on the Mass Pike. I can't do it. It was really became like a phobia. And I think with all these things, there just was a moment I was like, do I want to be a 40-year-old woman who cannot get on the highway? Like, you can't go a lot of places if you don't drive on the highway. And yet it's terrifying. And I think, we do things that are terrifying even when we are still terrified. Even now, every time I merge, it's been years and years, I think you are doing such a great job. I'm probably the only person who gives myself like a little compliment every time I merge onto, I-95.
Yeah. I give myself a compliment too, and I have not necessarily had a driving phobia. It's still pretty intense. It's
Right.
like, geez, Louise, come on, let me in.
Let me in. Right, exactly. I always have this. I mean, it's funny. It's been, I guess the events of the book are more than 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And the driving one is funny. I still am so aware that I used to not do this. And now, look at me. I am on the highway and I still take pleasure in it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and that speaks to some stuff maybe we'll get to afterwards, but I want to get to the reading so we can hear your chapter that is called Pizza. And with reference to those rules, pizza is one of them in terms of what you eat that is acceptable or not acceptable. And what is, I don't know, what was not kosher about pizza?
Okay, so there's different ways of keeping kosher and different, levels of strictness that people have with keeping kosher. I grew up and my family always kept it in a very strict way where kosher is certain foods are always kosher, certain foods are never kosher, and certain foods can't be mixed together. So,
Right.
for example, meat and milk. So any dairy, any meat can never be mixed together. You could have kosher meat and kosher dairy, but it can't be mixed. And the way that I grew up keeping kosher was that even if the ingredients were kosher, I wouldn't eat them unless they were certified kosher, unless there was a rabbi who observed the making of them to ensure that nothing was done to break any of the rules. And so I had eaten pizza many times, but only at a kosher restaurant, only at a certain restaurant. And whereas like pepperoni pizza would never be kosher because it's meat and milk, cheese pizza can be kosher, but according to the strictest definition, it would have to be at a place that was certified kosher. So
got it.
So the part I'm going to read is about a little trip with my son who was curious about why we only were going to eat in kosher restaurants, who wanted to ask, why couldn't we just go to Bill's down the street? But, and really was asking maybe some of the same questions I had as a child of what do the rules mean? What does it mean if I don't follow them? Do I get to choose for myself, who I'm going to be in the world? And at what age do I get to make those decisions? And what happens if I'm different than my family?
Yes.
I haven't read the chapter in many years. So I'm like, oh, what's going to be in here? What's going to be in this chapter? So
there's a lot in this chapter.
I'll be as surprised as anyone listening to it.
I wrote a little set of notes so the characters that we have are Josh, who is your middle son. Right. Middle child out of son, daughter. Aaron is your husband. the father of your 3 children. We're going to be in a couple different places. We're going to be in Boston, and then we're also going to be in Manhattan, young married life in Manhattan, as well as I know you mentioned where you went to school too. So, yeah, so I was curious about the non-kosher pizza because I knew about meat and dairy, but I wasn't sure.
Right.
So we'll hear a little bit more about where you were able to eat or not.
Yeah, and so many people might keep like ingredient kosher. Well, they'll say, "Oh, well, there's these ingredients are kosher." All I hear, that wasn't how we grew up, and so my kids never did that. So, I mean, it's funny, like rules. I guess depending on what you decide is taboo, that's where the transgression happens. And so
Right.
for us, this and one of the things I've learned about writing about religious communities, for one of the biggest moments in the memoir is driving, as you said, 3 minutes past sundown, which for many people would be like, what's the big deal about that? But when you're raised to believe that that is an enormous transgression, then it is a big deal. And so it just depends on
Yeah.
where the lines are drawn for you. And for me, that that kind of transgression was unimaginable, that I would ever do something like that.
Right, right. Which speaks to the whole, where are the rules, where do they fall, and how tightly they are in our brains, that
Exactly.
those are just imprinted upon us, and that's a feeling that's going to come out no matter what. So,
Exactly. And even if, it's been years since I drive all the time on Friday nights and Saturday, but there's still moments when I think, oh my, this is really this. I'm still aware of the transgression, even a decade later.
can I just let out a big sigh? Because it is like these things, they just stick with us even after we have said,
Right.
okay, I'm not going to keep it the way I used to keep Shabbat or keep Passover or keep kosher, but it's still up here and we still keep fighting those things.
Right. I think our childhoods are just so imprinted on us
Yeah.
that even if, years passed, I think we still are held by them in a certain way.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, why don't we get to it? So whenever you are ready, this is a chapter called Pizza.
Pizza. Bill's Pizza has oversized windows that open out to Beacon Street in the middle of Newton Center. It is a few weeks after my return from Israel, and the roads are covered with snow. Outside, passers-by peer in at this cozy restaurant scene. Josh is far too excited about this long-awaited outing to notice my trepidation at being here with him. I can't help but think about who might walk past and see us. I'm glad there's a long line. Still time to ponder the theological implications of a cheese slice. Still time to grab Josh and run. As we wait, Josh eyes the toppings through the glass case. Every vegetable combination seems exotic, as do the speckled rounds of pepperoni. On the drive here, I told Josh there was one condition. We could order only vegetarian. In the Codex of Sins, plain cheese pizza is a misdemeanor, not a felony. One slice, please, Josh tells the man behind the counter. Actually, 2 slices, I add. As we wait, I detect no sign of guilt on his face. My son is too young to know that food is as fraught as any other kind of pleasure. He has not experienced the kosher-induced anxiety that in a new place there might be nothing to eat. For our honeymoon trip to Italy, Aaron and I had packed 2 kosher salamis, one in each of our knapsacks, and in each city we visited, we sliced them thinly with a plastic knife, afraid we'd run out of food before we made it to Venice, where we'd heard rumors of a kosher pasta restaurant. For us, there was nothing to eat in Rome, where during August the one kosher restaurant was closed. Nothing in Florence, where we finished off the last of the salamis, and still hungry, drained jars of gefilte fish into the bidet of a pension. The discovery of a kosher Haagen-Dazs in the Piazza della Signora was as miraculous as the sight of Botticelli's Birth of Venus in the Uffizi nearby. When Josh sees me watching him, a serious look comes over his face. I need to talk to you, he tells me, his voice hushed, his expression earnest and intent. Bend down, he says, and he whispers into my ear. If one day I decide to eat pizza with meat on it, will you still like who I am? He asks. His face is unbearably solemn, his eyes trained on me as he awaits my reaction. Oh, Josh, I say, and as I look into his eyes, I feel my heart breaking open. Even at his young age, he knows the price to be paid for not following the rules. This, more than anything, was the iron bar across the exit door. Love was what tied you and kept you inside. Love was what you risked losing if you wanted to choose for yourself. Now there's a space break. I'm going to just give you the space breaks.
Yes.
Do you mind if I take off my hat? I whispered to Aaron. We had been married for a little over a year, and we were sitting at a reading at the KGB bar in downtown Manhattan, a dimly lit room decorated with Russian memorabilia. Every morning before I walked the 6 blocks to my graduate writing class, I stood in the bathroom of the apartment we moved into after our wedding on 110th Street in Manhattan. I brushed, scrunched, and moussed the fake hair of my fall, which is kind of a wig, the same way I'd once played with my brush hair doll, as I called it, a mounted plastic head of long blonde hair that I'd braided and curled until, in a rash moment, I cut her bald. I pulled some of my hair forward, clipped on the fall, then used my curls to cover the place where wig met hair. Can you come tell me if you see the line? I called to Aaron from my spot in front of the mirror. I can barely see it, he told me when he joined me in the bathroom, and only because I know it's there. Wanting to be reassured, I looked in the mirror more closely. The fall might not have been a perfect match, but there was a lot of hair. Some dark brown, some reddish, some curly, some mere waves. How many people in my writing workshop would be looking for a nearly imperceptible seam along my head, or would notice that the fake hair wasn't nearly as curly as the real hair? But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that it was fine, I noticed how the outer layer of fake hair slowly separated from the under layer of real hair. No assortment of bobby pins, no amount of spray or mousse could prevent this. Despite all the coaxing and styling, my own hair would have nothing to do with this outside entity, my body rejecting this foreign object. Even worse, when I studied it carefully, I noticed the bump where the fall was attached to my head, a subtle glimpse of something rising from inside. It's too obvious, I said, and ripped the fall off my head, then scrunched, curled, and attached it again. Nearly a whole bottle of mousse, all in the name of God. I started to say I hate this, but stopped myself. I didn't want to alarm Aaron with such an expression of discontent. I was supposed to feel that, with each bobby pin, I was securing our relationship. It was the early years of our marriage, a sanctified time. If we'd lived in biblical days, Aaron wouldn't have been drafted to war during the first year to allow him to spend time rejoicing in me, his bride. For us now, it meant that we were supposed to think of this period as an extended honeymoon. Only once the wig was close to undetectable would I leave for school, trying not to think about my hair and to focus instead on the novel I had started writing about a woman who converts to Judaism and moves to the Orthodox community in Memphis. I knew that I was supposed to portray Orthodoxy in largely positive terms. Any critical sentence could make people angry. Sometimes I read a few pages of what I'd written to my mother, and she'd laugh in appreciation, then worry what the communal fallout might be if it ever were published. I worried as well. Anything that did not uphold or affirm, could you think it? Could you say it? Even worse, did you dare write it? Yet being a writer, I was learning, required a willingness to cast aside these restrictions. To write was to enter an underground that was rich and teeming. The world wasn't a single fluorescent lit room, but a house with corners and hallways and passageways to explore. I lived in a small box in which I could barely breathe, read the opening to a classmate's novel in progress that we discussed that week. I'd put a check mark next to this sentence, then read it again, surprised by the power it had over me. I didn't think I felt that way, not really, but something stirred inside me. I love this, I scribbled in the margin, but what I wanted to write was, I'm afraid I am this. Walking 6 blocks up Broadway to the Columbia campus, I was distracted by the word wig. The sounds of the wind, wig, wig. The metal clips were supposed to be fail-proof, but what would happen if my hair fell off in the middle of class? If someone were to ask why I covered my hair, I could explain why this ritual felt meaningful to other people. But the truth was that I did it because I wanted to be seen by my community as the type of woman who covered her hair. I'd once heard a story about an Orthodox woman who was taking a chemistry lab and her wig caught on fire. Rather than rip the wig from her head, she tried to put the fire out, allowing the wig to singe. A few days later, so this story went, she got a new wig and came to class with hair that showed no sign of having been burned, claiming to have found a magic serum that restored burned hair. When I first heard the story before I was married, I thought she was crazy for not ripping off the wig. It was on fire, after all. But now I suspected I would have done the same. In the small, crowded bar where many of my classmates sat in groups, Erin and I sat by ourselves, constantly aware of how I wasn't like the rest of them, married and Orthodox and trying to hide a secret I wore in plain sight on my head. I was painfully shy. We had each ordered a Coke. The food wasn't kosher and drinking was foreign to us. Even though I was 25 and living in New York City, this, a crowded bar, was a place to which I was a young and uncertain visitor. Tired of worrying about whether I'd secured the fall exactly right, I was wearing a black baseball hat, so unobtrusive I hoped it could pass for some kind of half-hearted fashion statement. Aaron was wearing a baseball hat too over his yarmulke, a socially acceptable method of disguise, though his hat was emblazoned with the logo for the Boston Red Sox, the team in the city for which he pined. After our wedding, Aaron's parents had wanted us to move to Boston, even though I still had another 2 years of graduate school in New York. I didn't want to move. Since our engagement, the relationship with them had been fraught, and I worried that if we lived close, conflicts with them would overwhelm our independence. Marriage was supposed to confer adulthood, yet our life together often felt like an elaborate version of playing house. The hats I wore, little different from the ones in the bag of dress-up clothes I'd had as a child. Is it normal to fight a lot? I asked a friend who'd gotten married a year before I did, viewing her as wise older counsel. I tried not to think about how quickly Aaron and I had gotten engaged, so I wouldn't feel the awful worry that I had married before I was ready. It's normal, she said, and assured me that by the second year, when we really knew each other, everything would be much easier. I tried to listen to the reading, but the hat was pressing tightly against my forehead, the brim cutting across my view. I loosened the buckle and pulled it farther back on my head, but the line of hat still felt too constricting, as though my entire body were being compressed. Do you mind if I take off my hat? I whispered again to Aaron, hoping no one nearby would hear me. He looked at me in surprise. Though I'd complained about covering my hair, it never seemed possible that I would actually stop. He was sympathetic, but I knew that, unlike me, he didn't feel as if the edges of orthodoxy could close in on him. My question felt dangerous, as though I were asking about lifting off the marriage itself for a few hours. If you want to, Aaron said nervously. I took off the hat and lay it on the table next to our refills of Coke. Viewed from this vantage point, the hat looked innocuous enough, hardly the vice I'd come to see it as. Do you think it's bad? I asked him as I shook out my hair and felt like I could not only see more clearly, but breathe more easily as well. I'm fine with it, he said. Are you really? I asked. I can see the difference in you, Aaron acknowledged. When we left the reading, I put the hat back on and took his hand as we walked. The hat felt tighter, as though my head had grown larger, my hair thicker. It's a slippery slope, the rabbi still present in my mind warned. It would only be this one time, I decided. I would try harder to keep covering my hair, just as I prayed every morning before I left for class, cooked Shabbat meals each week, immerse myself in the mikveh, the ritual bath, each month. Doubt would be stamped out like a small fire. More than anything, I wanted to be the person Aaron had married, still the girl he'd seen when he lifted the veil at our wedding. Is everything okay? I asked as we got ready for bed. Our apartment was a pre-war building set back from the street with a wide courtyard and peeling green shutters, the facade arrayed with stone gargoyles set up like sentries to watch over the building's inhabitants. It's fine, he said, but even so I wanted to apologize. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had endangered us, as though I'd tarnished the wedding photo that was displayed by our bedside. Any sin I knew wasn't mine alone. Now that we were married, we represented each other. If I didn't cover my hair, Aaron was less religious just by being married to me. We had signed the ketubah, the official marriage contract, at our wedding, but I knew that another contract existed between us as well. In this unwritten document that was equally binding and unchangeable, we agreed that we would stay the same as we were now. We would always be Orthodox, not just observing the rules, but living within the communal expectations. When we had kids, we would move to one of the nearby modern Orthodox communities in Riverdale or Teaneck, as our married friends were starting to do. We would send our kids to modern Orthodox schools where our friends sent their kids. We were young, but the years ahead were scripted. A few months after I'd briefly removed my baseball hat, I was walking home from school, and amid the crowds of pedestrians, I caught a reflection in the storefront mirror of a Love's drugstore. A girl in a t-shirt and long beige skirt. On her head, a matching beige hat with a floral decoration, her dark curls barely visible under the brim. She looked strikingly familiar, but my mind did a double take. For one moment, I didn't recognize this religious woman as myself. People bustled around me in a Manhattan hurry, but I stopped walking. I stared at my reflection. It was hard not to rip off the hat right there, not to strip down on Broadway to the person I sensed waiting below. A voice, stronger than I knew I had, whispered in my head, "This is not who you are." I continued to cover my hair, but started wearing pants again. I reveled in the long-lost pleasure of jeans. They hugged my legs and made me feel powerful, capable of confidently striding anywhere. Was it this feeling, I wondered, that was actually the most forbidden part? When I was in college, wearing pants had seemed like a grave sin, but now at least I didn't have to worry that the Orthodox boys I liked wouldn't date me. I still worried about being judged by my community, but being married bestowed a level of immunity. It's just this one thing, I assured Aaron, who seemed to be okay with it, though I didn't know for sure. One day I came home to a message on the answering machine. I'd shown a finished draft of my novel to the literary agent for whom I'd interned one summer, and had spent the past 3 weeks in a state of nervous anticipation, waiting to hear from her. Every time the phone rang, I jumped. "I'm calling to say that I read your book and loved it," the agent said in the message. Thrilled, I went to meet the agent without my hat or the fall. I felt as though I'd never before walked outside so bare, as though I'd gone out without pants or a shirt. But I couldn't imagine talking to her about my novel while feeling so false and covered. I was still afraid of any negative reaction to my portrayal of orthodoxy. Yet, in the 3 years that I'd been working on the book, I'd fallen in love with the feeling, rare but there sometimes, that I could find a way past the erected barriers. The words were not in my mind, but actually in my hands, my fingers sprinting freely toward the fences. After I met with the agent, Aaron and I went out to dinner to celebrate, my hair still uncovered. "I'm going to stop covering my hair," I told him, and looked into his eyes, wanting him to see all of me. I tried to tell myself that this was just one more slight adjustment so that I could better stay inside. But I understood that when you began listening to the quiet internal voice, it might grow louder. I guess it's okay, he said. Are you sure you don't mind? I asked, as though I were squeezing him for some darker truth. He was trying to be comfortable with what I had decided, but I recognized the anxiety in his smile. Do you think you're going to change any more? He asked. I won't, I assured him. But I too was uneasy. It was too late to change. Once you were married, you were supposed to know who you were. Unsaid but present between us was the story we both knew, not about anyone specific, but a general threat that the good girl could inexplicably morph into something unrecognizable, a Medusa like creature whom the laws could not tame. Once I stopped covering my hair, I felt like I could see more clearly, as though I'd started wearing glasses I'd badly needed. I made a pile of my everyday hats and gave them to a friend who was getting married, saving only the dressy ones I would still wear to synagogue on Shabbat, where there was no choice. I wasn't sure what to do with the fall. It seemed like some sort of bodily appendage that should be buried with ritual and ceremony, or else an unwanted item set on the windowsill so the city birds could carry it off and make, somewhere in Central Park, a nest crafted from genuine human hair. My own hair was matted from being covered and had thinned at the front of my scalp. Since getting married, I'd paid little attention to my actual curls. In need of restoration, I went to a Manhattan salon that specialized in curly hair. Here, curls were treated as exotic, endangered creatures. Rather than straightened, curls were sculpted, gathered, cherished. Before I'd covered my hair, I might have been frustrated with the unruliness of my curls, but now they were an indispensable part of who I was. That week, I invited a table full of Shabbat guests, as I always did, baked challah, made chicken and vegetables and kugels and desserts. Before Shabbat started, I set up my silver candlesticks, and when it was time, I lit the candles, waving my hands 3 times in front of me as though ushering the light toward me. Placing my hands over my eyes, I whispered the blessing, adding a prayer for our families, as my mother did each week, as my grandmothers had done as well. In doing so, I was linking myself even more with them, as though I were lighting my candles not from a match, but from their still burning flames. Together, Aaron and I went to the synagogue across the street from our apartment. In recent years, the congregation had dwindled to a few old members, but friends of ours had started a Friday night service there that was spirited and soulful, part of a small transformation underway in modern Orthodoxy to create more participatory services. Instead of the women being relegated to the balcony, a divider was placed down the middle of the mostly empty sanctuary, and the women were invited to sit downstairs, separate but at least a little more equal. From my spot in the newly made women's side, I watched as the people in the wooden pews around me began to sing melodically, joyfully. There was no perfunctory performance of obligation, no hurrying through to get home quickly. Sing unto God a new song, sing unto the Lord all the earth, we sang in Hebrew. Columbia students and professors and neighborhood families, retired men who had come here since they were young, elderly women who looked askance at these changes but eventually relented and sang as well. Let the heavens be glad, let the earth rejoice, let the sea roar. I sang along with the others. All these contradictions and places of constriction, they weren't all that mattered. There was this too, the words of the prayers, old and new, above me and inside me. Then, with our friends assembled around the folding table we'd set up in our living room, I brought out the food I'd spent all day making, using the platters we had received as wedding gifts, feeling as though I were serving a piece of myself. When I cooked and served Shabbat dinner, I was like all the other Orthodox women I knew. One week we were invited to Shabbat dinner by friends of ours who'd recently had a baby. Their silver candlesticks were lined up on the white tablecloth, 3 candles burning, one for each member of their small family. This was the scene I'd imagined whenever I envisioned how my life was supposed to look. I think we're ready to have a family, I said to Aaron. Just space break. Josh's question hangs over me. Will you love me if I'm not like you? Will you love me if I choose something else? Oh, Josh, I say again, as we get our slices of pizza, oversized triangles with sturdy crusts and thick layers of cheese, I begin a series of proclamations. I will love you whoever you are. I will respect the choices you make. I will not be happy if you harm yourself or others, but decisions will be yours. He's looking at me with eyes wide open, wondering if he can believe me. He wants to give himself over to my reassurance, yet already at the age of 9, he understands that, given the world to which he was born, it's a complicated proposition. All I can do is assure him that, in my love for him, there aren't edges past which he can't venture. My love for him is capacious enough for him to grow and change. It has ample space for whoever he wants to become. You're only at the start of figuring out who you're going to be. You don't have to be held back by what others think of you. You have the right, the need to decide what you believe, I say, trusting he understands at least part of what I'm saying. I'm in high gear speech making mode, talking too fast with far more passion and honesty than he expected. His eyes are open wide as he listens intently to me. Any moment he will change the subject to the Patriots or the Red Sox. His eyes will drift to the ESPN blaring TV attached to the wall behind us. But until then, I'm saying words that I'm starting to trust, offering sentences that are becoming truer in my own mind as I say them. This is the most delicious pizza in the world, he exclaims, though I've privately decided that I prefer the thin slices at Regina's in Boston's North End. Life, I continue on, wanting to impart this not just to Josh, but to my younger self, is about exploring and grappling and growing. You're allowed to change even when it's painful. You're allowed to decide who you want to be. Josh has sauce dotted at the corners of his mouth. He is savoring the slice.
Oh my God, thank you so much.
Thank you. Oh, it's something I haven't read it in so long. It's almost
How does it feel? I'm very teary from that.
Me too. It's funny, you write something and you live it, you write about what you've lived, and maybe the act of writing it puts it away in a certain sense. So it's funny, in reading it after so many years, I had the feeling of, oh, this right. This is what it is. This is what it was. But it feels jarring. I have to say, I'm teary eyed. It's strange.
Yes. Well, let's both.
I know. I did. Yeah.
I'll take over for a little bit so you can breathe.
Compose myself.
Yeah. I mean, okay. Of all the things that I love about what you say and how you say it, include such a minuscule thing as eating a slice of pizza as being the possible transgression on some sliding scales of real problems, to kind of state it mildly. And so you're going for pizza with your son, and it is the most mundane yet the most impactful thing that you can do for this boy you're raising, to try and imbue in him the trust and the love that is his to choose. I mean, it's huge. It's huge.
Right. I think it's one of the quandaries as a parent. You love your children and you raise them, and as they get older, you relinquish control, if you even had it to begin with, over who they're going to be. This idea that you might have an imagined version of who your kids are and what you think it's going to look like. But kids get to choose their own lives. We all get to choose our lives. And I think, I used to think the hardest part of being a parent, is having kind of keep hold of the three kids, kind of manage everyone, corral everyone. And I
Yeah.
think as my kids have gotten older, what I've really come to see is the real challenge of parenting is being able to let go, to stay close, to love them, to be there, but to let go of the idea that they have to match you or they have to be who you want them to be. It's really to allow them to be who they want to be. And it's hard. It's not always easy to do it, but I think that is the real gift we can give children and anyone we love, to allow people to be themselves.
The hardest thing and the most important thing.
Right. Even, in any kind of relationship and friendships and parental relationships and romantic relationships, the sense of how do I stay close to someone and connected and yet not try to control or not make you be, I don't want to make you be the person who I want you to be, but how can I love the person who you are? And I think that is where you really create authenticity. But it's hard. It's hard watching kids change. It's hard being taken by surprise, when you're like, oh, I didn't know this was how it was going to be, right? This wasn't what I had imagined, or I didn't know this about you, but now I do. And shifting your notion of the way it's going to look, or who the people around you are going to be.
And if I might ask, you show us in some scenes and writing through the book about that same relationship and mirroring upwards, if you will, with your parents who are still Orthodox. Yet there are some really tenuous moments where we see your mom asking you questions and the push and pull on that side as well. And so I can only imagine it was you looking backwards at what had happened to you, and that your parents did give you enough space to grow, choose, become yourself in spite of their questions or concerns. Am I guessing correctly here?
Yes, very much so. And, I think anytime your 40-year-old daughter calls you and says, big news, I'm getting divorced, I'm not going to be Orthodox anymore, we, this feeling that, our kids can upend us, that can, just shift the ground. And, I'm sure for my parents, it was an earthquake, what I was saying. It was, shocking that, this idea that they knew that I was unhappy, and it wasn't out of the blue, certainly, but still, it was still a big, big announcement. And I feel like they said the most beautiful words that any parent can offer a child, we will be there for you. And,
Yes.
and it didn't mean that they were fully comfortable with it. It didn't mean that it was what they would have chosen for me. I know that. And yet, even so, they could say, we will be there for you, whatever this is going to look like. And I think that really, those are like the kindest words maybe anyone can offer, because it's hard when the people around you change. I'd like to believe we all, everyone can be themselves, but it's not simple. It's not simple when the people we're close to make enormous changes that change us as well, that force us to change. In a family, one piece changing changes the whole configuration. But
right,
I think, the goal or the work is being able to sit with the hard parts and to say, yeah, this does feel uncomfortable sometimes, or it's complicated sometimes, but the alternative would be not being connected. And that, I feel like, especially in family relationships, shouldn't be an option.
In between our scene of pizza at the top and tail of this chapter, first, I was trying to think of a metaphor for describing this structure that you use, I think, throughout the book. First, I was going to call it nesting dolls, but it wasn't really that, but it's a little more layered. And you sort of take us in this spiral through your own personal history and these very, again, small moments. Like there's just a compilation of so many tiny moments where you're like, I think I don't want to wear this hat.
Right. Small and yet enormous.
Exactly. I just really like the feeling of wearing pants. and what these things mean. And I guess the more writerly side of this is, were these moments that you chose and then picked this kind of spiraling structure? How did you match the moments up, I guess, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of my favorite things about writing is I love structure. Whenever someone wants to talk about how to structure a novel, I'm like, ooh, let's dig in there.
Yes,
Like
exactly.
I
Yeah.
love, it feels like building something. I feel like that's what, more than anything, I think that's the subject that really like sets my writer's mind on fire. Because,
Mm,
certainly, as opposed to a novel where you're creating the story, memoir, the story, but you still have the same question as you have in a novel of how are you going to tell it? What in what order, and where do you begin, and how do you move forward, and then do you go backward? I thought of it as switchbacks. Go forward, we go backward. We go forward, we
yes.
go backward. And
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
spent a lot of time coming up with the structure. I wanted to have this year. I knew I was going to follow the cycle of the year. I mean, I followed the cycle of the Jewish year. I feel like for all it was a book about leaving, it's also a book about being very connected. And so that still maps the year.
Yeah.
I felt like in order for the reader to understand leaving, you had to understand staying. You had to understand being inside it, what it, in all its complexities. I wasn't going to write oh, here's the horrible past, now I'm free in the future. It was so much more complicated than that. This sense of
Right.
push and pull and connection and discontent and longing to be inside and difficulty being inside, all those wrapped together. So there was a day where I like took printed it out and like laid it out on like across the living room floor. And I thought of it as these series of arcs, like these sort of overlapping rainbow arcs where we're going to move forward, but in each moving forward, I'm going to take you backward and
Yeah.
try to line it up. Sometimes it felt like by the skin of my teeth, I got it to line up so that the theme of the forward moving chapter could match the background chapter, and I would move things around. I was like a mad scientist, like moving my papers, and I was like,
Yeah.
telling the kids, do not walk in here. There's, it was like my little laboratory of papers everywhere.
Yes.
But I feel like structure feels like it's like working a puzzle. It's solving a mystery. It's like, what's the way to tell this? And it always feels like, you snap something in place, like, oh, this is the starting point. And if this is the starting
Right.
point, where do I stop to go backward? And I always feel like maybe it has to do with like authorial hand, where if I convince you as the reader, don't worry, we're going forward. Don't you worry. I'm taking you forward in time. Just give me 1 minute to backtrack here. And always wanting the
Right.
reader to feel like we're not going to meander, where I'm not getting you lost. We're going to return to the present day moment. And so I just thought of it as, we go forward, we pause, we back up, and then I bring you back to the present day storyline. And as long as the reader trusts the sort of the authorial confidence of the writer to take you forward again, I feel like then you're willing to go backward with me. And so I just
Yeah.
played with it and played with it. And, it's funny, I did not, when you asked me to read the pizza chapter, I was like, oh, I know the pizza story. The pizza chapter was excerpted in the Modern Love column. So I read that column more
Oh.
recently. So I was
Oh,
like,
okay.
I know the
I didn't
pizza
even know
story.
that. So
Yeah. So I was like, when I started reading, I was like, oh, hair covering, the hair is in here. But I was like, oh, hair is in there because it's another moment of, the pizza is the same as the hair. They're asking, I'm asking
Right.
Aaron, my ex-husband, the same question of, will you still love me if I do this? And so that's why that story gets to nestle inside the pizza story. And
Yeah.
maybe it's some kind of like emotional or thematic connection, but it's, so many charts and graphs I make for myself. I sketch it out. I, try to get a structure that feels sound.
Yeah. Did you have to write it all out linearly to start, so that you knew what the pieces were that you were trying to fit?
I probably wrote the external storyline first, or sketched that out. And partially, this was where, as a novelist, I was like, memoir is so great. All I have to do is ask myself, what happened that year? I went back to my phone. I was like, oh, right. I looked at pictures. I was like, oh, that's what happened in April. So I sort of mapped the cycle of this year, the first year of my divorce, this year of separation, really. And that created my external structure. And that's probably it felt like the skeleton I needed to nail down. And I didn't necessarily write it in order. I probably sketched some scenes, or I'm a very messy first draft writer. I just write notes like, right
Hmm.
scene in which this happens, or need dramatic moment, or need
Oh,
something. And then
interesting.
I would
Yeah.
probably, I wrote a lot of the other pieces more piecemeal, the memories. I, didn't know the order they were going to go. I didn't know. And there were many, many drafts of the book. There was an earlier version where I think it went forward and then long, long backstory and then forward, as opposed to the more switchback mode. I think my editor suggested that, and I played with it, trying to get it to line up right. But I guess the danger of backstory is always, you don't want to lose your present momentum. That's always the risk of backstory.
Exactly.
So that was always the anxiety of like, if I take you back into my childhood or take you back into my marriage, will you forget that we're sitting in a pizza restaurant in the present day moment?
Right. Well, there is great trust in the narrative voice and arc of each chapter because I go, "Oh yeah, that's right. We're going back to the pizza." And it gives you something to think over. It
Right.
gives you something to mull on. Um oh gosh, so many other things I was going to ask you about. I mean, I think as we talked about a little before, like what we show on the outside and who we are on the inside. And this was just such a great example of that, of like, why do I have to wear this fall? And what is the head covering? And oh, I know, I was going to say, I also felt as I think I listened to it before I read it. And so I thought, wow, she's spending a lot of time talking about faith and ceremony and religious ritual for someone who leaves. But it's not about entirely leaving. It's about also staying. And I'm curious about your faith today.
Right. I mean, I wanted to, even in the chapter I read, I was like, oh, I forgot that I felt that way in
Mm,
synagogue. I forgot
yeah,
that feeling of being consumed by, a room full of people singing in unison, like that
right.
feeling. It's such a powerful feeling to feel that you sing with one voice in a room full of people and to have that sense of belief. I don't feel that kind of belief. I don't feel that sense of maybe theological belief. I do feel a sense of connection. I still feel a sense of connection to Jewish history, to my family's history, to a larger story, whether I believe in it as a truth or not. And so I still
Mhm.
try to find way, maybe especially as time has gone on. I think whenever you leave something, there's a trauma. And I think any leave taking has a traumatic element where being connected in any way, I would feel like I have an allergic reaction to being around anything religious. For a long time, I felt that way. And that has eased with time. I think just with time, just the more time that I have had to grow my new layer of skin, to become my own person, it doesn't threaten me or doesn't aggravate me in the same way as it did. And I can sort of see religious belief and see what it brings people and the power it has for people, even if it's not what I believe personally or what I experience.
That was another thing that I thought you did so well in portraying the differences of what people feel and accepting that, that you have a brother who is
Right.
extremely orthodox.
Yes.
He's a rabbi.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's a rabbi. He's part of an ultra Orthodox community in
Yeah.
Israel. And I guess we come upon this in so many ways with people, like that people are different.
Yeah.
People believe, like people we love might think things so different
Yeah.
from us. It's somehow this shock of like something that seems so clear to me is not at all clear to someone else, or something that seems like the obvious truth to one other person might seem completely impossible to me. And that,
Mm.
I think, is like the strangeness of living among people. And so my brother believes, he wholeheartedly believes, and I don't. And how do you explain that? Grew up in the same family, and yet
Right.
we all come with our differences. And I think the fantasy version, that I maybe took in growing up was we all are the same. We all think the same thing. And I think that's my novelist sensibility. I'm always asking people questions. I'm like, oh, well, what were you feeling when that happened? I'm always interested in like what was really going on there. There's,
Right.
writers are so interested in the idea of well, here's what's being said, here's what's done, but what's really going on here? Like that phrase, what's really going on? People, my kids will probably laugh. I think I must say that like to them constantly. What do you think that's really about? What's really going on there? Like that's the writer's question of like, what is really happening for this person and what is going on inside people's lives and what are the private desires and fears, the sentences not spoken. That's the stuff that makes me write.
Oh, so good. So good. I love it. So my capper of a question is always, what was most daring about this book for you? What was hardest?
I think the idea that I was going to put it out in the world, not as fiction, that I could have fictionalized the story. It was clear. It was an obvious path of how to fictionalize it. But I felt like this question of, am I allowed to like feel what I feel? And am I allowed to say what I think? And that then people will know, people will know who I am. And I mean, fiction is my love, my real love, but there's always a mask. Invisible City is in some ways so transparently me. It's almost mortifying, but only if you know me. If you don't know me, if you pick up that book, you don't know where I am. I can look at every page and cringe, but no one else knows it. Fiction, I think it's the willingness to be unmasked in the world, to know that some people will be furious, people will be angry, people will feel this tramples upon something they hold dear, people will not speak to you afterwards, people will feel they know you intimately, even if you don't know them. But it was this idea that I was going to say what I really thought, that I was willing to own my story. I was willing to say, like, for better or worse, for all the complicated parts, for all the ways you could say, how could you do such a thing? And, you have children and all these things you could say, that I was going to stand by my own experience, I was not going to view myself through the eyes of others, but that the story was going to be my story. And I was going to own and live inside my own experience more fully than watching myself from some outside critical gaze.
That's really very big and I will say, such a huge model for other writers who are trying to do the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, I wanted to say with memoirs, I found that, I feel like one story invites another story, and I published a piece of the memoir as an essay before I started writing it. It was the sort of the divorce ceremony, and it ran in the New York Times as a private lives column. It was terrifying. It was the first thing I'd put out in the world, like a real personal essay. I was so terrified, shaking, terrified to have done that. And immediately I started just getting this huge avalanche of emails from people who sharing their story, and all walks of life, all religious backgrounds, leaving religious communities, marriages. And I felt like being willing to be vulnerable invites other people to be vulnerable. And I feel like a story holds out its hand to another story. And that, I think it's why we write memoir, why we read memoir. I think it's the hunger to know what people really think, to the hunger to really be taken inside people's inner lives, like sort of almost a fatigue from the outside layer of everyone's, facade, Facebook ready, my life is perfect mode. I feel like memoir is the hunger for real experience. And the more one person shares their experience, the more it makes room for other people to share their experiences too.
I don't think we can say anything better than that. Thank you. What are you working on next? Because I know you're going back to your love of fiction next.
Yes. After the memoir, I was like, okay, it is fiction time. But I was ready to, partially I felt like, okay, I don't have any more memoir material. I think I've used it all for a while. But I have a novel coming out in February called We Would Never. And in some ways, it's a very different book for me. And in some ways, it's my same theme. But it's a story about a close-knit Florida family who might or might not have done something unimaginable in the wake of their daughter's divorce. But I think I was inspired by a true crime story that I was obsessed with, obsessed. I couldn't stop thinking about it. And really for the same reason, I felt like I could read about it in the news. I could read about it in true crime blogs. I could listen to a podcast about it. I could see it on Dateline, but it never gave me what I wanted to know. It was about a family that seems to have hired a hitman to kill their daughter's ex-husband, this wild, horrifying thing. but nothing could give me their souls, like their inner lives, nothing. And I felt like fiction was the only way to answer the question of, how does a family do something? How do you go from being normal, whatever normal means, to plotting a murder? How do you lose sight of yourself? And so I took the true crime story, sort of the bones of that story, and turned it into a novel.
Oh, wow. Well, that sounds fantastic. I can't wait to
Thank you.
get my eyes and ears on that one.
Thank
Are
you.
you reading it by any chance?
I
Are
am
you gonna?
not. It's funny. I had never. I somehow they hired someone. They didn't even ask me, but I feel like fiction. It seems more acted. Memoir. I really wanted to read it. I
Yes,
felt like it
of
was just
course.
like it felt so personal. The novel, I don't know how it would work for me. I feel like I love listening to audiobooks of novels. I feel like there's such a theatricality to it. I don't know that I could do it
Yes.
justice to read it.
No, I totally understand that. And as an audio person myself,
Yeah.
I love my love and passion is memoirists reading their own
I
work.
love it.
But I also agree with you about fiction. It's like this is a different beast and it deserves a narrative way of being told in the story. Yeah.
Right. With memoir, listening to the writer read it, it just feels so personal. I feel like they're with me. I listen while I drive. And so I feel like they're along with me for the ride when I have a memoirist reading them.
Yeah. Well, Tova Mirvis, thank you so much for being on Daring to Tell. It was great to hear from you today.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. And thank you for reading the book.
Oh my God, is she not great? One thing I found most fascinating about this conversation about her book was how she was writing out her inner life in her fiction before her outer self could catch up with what was actually going on. It is amazing to me how different parts of us can know things that sometimes the fully conscious frontal lobes have to eventually catch up with. And that is where the bravery lies. That is really what I'm always searching for in this podcast, the examples of the bravery. As you know, possibly, if you've listened to this podcast enough, I'm not really much of a fiction reader, but after having this conversation with her, it does really pique my curiosity to step inside of fiction more often. I am definitely interested in that new book coming out that she talked about, We Would Never, but I actually think after this conversation, I'm most interested in going back to read Visible City and see the book that she was writing during this year that we just heard about and read about today. That is fascinating to me. And can I also just say how it emphasizes that books are forever. I love that we can discover a book when we are ready for it. And yes, they are on a constantly churning schedule of new books coming out, but you never know what book is already out there that is waiting just for you at this moment. Of course, the place to find all of her books, including the one we heard today, The Book of Separation, is on her website, tovamirvis.com, and there is a link for that in the show notes, of course. A few other orders of business before we wrap up. If you've enjoyed this conversation, please be sure to follow the podcast on your podcast app so it'll automatically pop into your listening queue on the first Tuesday of each month when I aim like the dickens to get it posted. Tell a friend, tell your reading group, tell your writing group about this podcast. Share about it on social media if you would like to help me spread the word. Did you know that I just won the silver for Best Indie Podcast from the Signal Awards? I was super pleased about that. And there's an impressive exterior endorsement if that helps. So please share about the podcast. And if you enjoy my musings, well, you may also enjoy my newsletter. It's called The Redo. It comes out just once a month. And hopefully it is another little thoughtful, friendly missive where I get to think about some other stuff that I might not have gotten to when I have these daring conversations with writers. You can sign up for that at my website, michellerado.com. Again, link in the show notes. Also, I just like to note that December can be a tough month for so many people. So if that's you, I just want to say, yeah, I know. I am not usually a prescriptive sort of person, but if I were going to offer some of the things that I always forget to do during tough times, I would say be gentle with yourself. I would say listen to good music. I would say read a good book. And be in a space where you can allow your mind to wander. And speaking of good music, a giant thank you to my musician husband, Phil Rado, who writes and plays all the music you hear on this podcast, including this song, which I consider to be the memoir writer's theme song, Make Me Brave. Most of all, thanks to you for making it all the way to the end of yet another episode and for daring to listen. I will catch you next month.
And nothing's gonna break my fall. There's nothing in the protocol. It's like swimming up waterfall or taking away the ground. Taking away the ground. It's like taking away the ground.